where economic output is below potential output. Now again, the very first thing that we want to do is to figure out where inflation was so that the short-run aggregate supply curve is in long-run equilibrium. And what we can see is that to have been in long-run equilibrium, expected inflation needs to be equal to pi naught. Above pi 1, where the short-run aggregate supply curve intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve. So now, knowing that we're at point A, inflation is at pi 1, economic output is at y1, what happens in year 2? Again, if we remember our equation for expected inflation, in year 2, expected inflation is now going to equal actual inflation in year 1. So expected inflation now has moved down. It's declined from pi naught to pi 1. So that decline in expected inflation means that the short-run aggregate supply curve has shifted down. How far does it shift down? Well, all that we need to know is that it will cross the long-run aggregate supply curve at its expected inflation rate. So expected inflation comes down to pi 1. The short-run aggregate supply curve also shifts down. Now, before we move away from point A, let's see what we have here. At an inflation rate of pi 1, notice demand is going to be on the aggregate demand curve. So demand is still at y1. Producers, at an actual and expected inflation rate of pi 1, want to produce potential output. So we either have excess supply or we have insufficient demand. Glass half full or half empty, right? So what's going to happen in that case? Inventories are going to be building. There's going to be pressure on businesses to cut production and to move the inventories out, cut prices. Or to lay off workers, which means that wages would be rising less quickly. So as that happens, we move back along our short-run aggregate supply curve. At the same time, because inflation is coming down, the central bank is reducing the real interest rate along the monetary policy curve. So the real interest rate is coming down. Lower real interest rate will increase borrowing and expending, planned expenditures, and that will increase economic output along the IS curve, which means it also increases economic output along the aggregate demand curve. So we see then that as inflation comes down, it reduces production and increases spending until we get to point B, where we now have a short-run equilibrium at pi 2, lower inflation rate, but economic output has gone up to y2. What's happened to the unemployment rate in year 2? There are only 3 things you can guess, right? Went up and went down and stayed the same. Didn't stay the same. So there are only 2 things you can guess. Decreased, right? Economic output rises relative to potential. Unemployment rate will decline relative to the natural rate. Will the unemployment rate be above or below the natural rate? So in year 2, is the unemployment rate above or below the natural rate? Above, right? How do we know that? Right. We have a negative output gap. Whenever we have a negative output gap, we have a positive unemployment gap. Whenever the economy is below potential, the unemployment rate is above the natural rate of unemployment. So here we are at point B in short-run equilibrium, still not long-run equilibrium. Now we have to think about what happens in year 3. And notice this is simply a repeat of what we've already done. Find out how, since inflation fell to pi 2, expected inflation in year 3 will now adjust down to pi 2. We've got a change in inflation expectations. That causes the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift down. But before anything happens to inflation, we still have aggregate demand at point B. We have short-run aggregate supply curve, short-run aggregate supply along our long-run aggregate supply curve. That is a potential output. We're still producing too much. Inventories are still building. We still need to reduce production. Fewer resources, less pressure on inflation. And what we see is inflation falls. Inflation falls because we have less production. That also leads to lower real interest rates along the monetary policy curve, which leads to higher economic output along the IS curve. So as inflation goes down, economic output rises some more, to Y3. And just as we saw in our earlier example, the changes in year 3 will be smaller than the changes in year 2. The output gap is getting smaller and smaller, so the downward pressure in inflation is getting less and less. But point C, still not general equilibrium. So this process will then continue until we get to point N, where inflation has now fallen to pi n, and economic output is back at potential at yn. Economic output is back at potential, but we now have a permanently lower and now steady inflation. Again, notice if we were to look at a scatter plot of inflation in the output gap, starting here and ending here, what we end up with, again, is a counterclockwise move, in this case from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Now, a couple of things we might want to think about. One is, how do we know where general equilibrium will be? How do we know where general equilibrium will ultimately end up? It's real easy. Here's your rule of thumb. Find the relevant aggregate demand curve. Now, I say relevant because there may have been some shocks that are moving the aggregate demand curve around. Right? So whatever the last aggregate demand curve is, find out. Where does that intersect the relevant long-run aggregate supply curve? Again, if there's been a shift in the aggregate supply curve, you need to find the last one. General equilibrium will always be where the relevant aggregate demand curve intersects the relevant long-run aggregate supply curve. Notice that the other thing that implies, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift until it gets to that point. It's the short-run aggregate supply curve that is shifting, not the AD curve, not the long-run aggregate supply curve. It's the short-run aggregate supply curve that moves. It's an adjustment on inflation expectations that brings the economy back to general equilibrium. Now, a second issue to think about. Would the adjustment to general equilibrium be faster or slower if the short-run aggregate supply curve were steeper? So think about a really steep short-run aggregate supply curve. Does the adjustment process, see here we went through at least 3 years, and clearly there's more than that, at least 4 or 5, maybe 6. So would we get to general equilibrium, starting with the same output gap, would we get back to general equilibrium faster or slower if the short-run aggregate supply curve is steep? Faster, right? Much faster, depending upon how steep it is. So consider this. Suppose we had complete wage and price flexibility. The short-run aggregate supply curve would be vertical. There'd be no difference between the long-run curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve. So any change then in aggregate demand, shifting up or down, would have no effect on economic output and only an effect on inflation. So you would never be away from potential output. Now think about the opposite way. Suppose wages and prices are very sticky. So the short-run aggregate supply curve is very flat. Doesn't have to be horizontal, but very flat. Notice that in this case, any aggregate demand move only gives you a small increase in inflation, which means you only get a small increase in the real interest rate along the monetary policy curve, which means you'll get only a small decline in economic output along the IS curve. So the output gap doesn't narrow very quickly. So since it's getting the output gap back down to 0 before we get to general equilibrium, when a short-run aggregate supply curve is quite steep, something closer to the classical framework, then the economy cannot be away from general equilibrium for very long. However, if the short-run aggregate supply curve is quite flat, as most original Keynesians believe, and many even today, most even today, then you can have a short-term equilibrium exist for a long period of time. So you may recall when we talked about business fluctuations earlier, one of the things that I pointed out was wage and price stickiness or flexibility is a major source of controversy in macroeconomics. It also forces us to think about how business fluctuations develop, how rapidly they will resolve themselves, and therefore has important implications for government policies. So think about the classical model. In a classical model, very steep short-run aggregate supply curve, you can't be away from potential output for very long, which means the unemployment rate cannot be different from the natural rate by very much. But as I recall, the unemployment rate at the end of 2007 was about 4.5%. And a year and a half later, maybe 2 years later, it was at 10%. That seems like a big difference, big change to me. So does that suggest that maybe we had a bigger change in economic output? Now we've seen the unemployment rate come back down, but it's taken 4 years to get us anywhere close to the natural rate of unemployment. So does that tell us that wages and prices are nearly flexible, completely flexible, or not? What if, rather than thinking about the short-run aggregate supply curve, we thought about the shock that hit in 2008 as being a long-run aggregate supply shock? So rather, that the natural rate of unemployment went up a whole bunch, along with the real unemployment rate, the actual unemployment rate. Many classical economists would make that argument. Most Keynesians would say maybe we had a shock to the long-run aggregate supply curve, but we clearly seem to have a very, very flat short-run aggregate supply curve. Inflation has gone down, not a lot, but unemployment rate has actually gone up quite a bit. What does the evidence suggest? As I've mentioned before, economic data is not actually robust enough to reject either of these hypotheses in a statistically convincing way. And therefore, people fall back not on the empirical evidence, but rather fall back on ideological beliefs about how the economy operates. Okay, so again, keep in mind that the adjustment process that we see in the economy is always going to be because the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to be shifting. When it shifts, it will ultimately bring the economy back to long-run equilibrium. This mechanism of changes in the short-run aggregate supply curve is referred to as the economy's self-correcting mechanism. The self-correcting mechanism. Knock the economy off of general equilibrium, it has a self-correcting mechanism. We can argue about how fast or how slow that might be, but Keynesians as well as classicals both agree that there is a self-correcting mechanism to the economy. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind, problem set number 3 is due at the beginning of class on Tuesday. So not to ruin your weekend, but be sure you do it. Have a nice weekend, and I will see you Tuesday afternoon.